that we are in the 43rd session of Mark, looking today at chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. It's about 16 verses. That's a little more than we generally manage in one setting. But we have here the healing of a demon-possessed lad. That's our title. We left our four people, Jesus and Peter, James, and John, coming down from the mountain of transfiguration as Jesus gave them a command of silence and settled questions regarding Elijah and J.B. John the Baptist. Well, in this session, we find what happened as they completed their descent and came to where the other 9 disciples on the inner circle were embroiled in an event. Mark, ironically, gives us the longest, most detailed description of this event. Let's begin in Mark 9:14. And when they, that's Jesus and the 3, came back to the other 9 disciples, of course Mark doesn't say other 9, Don says other 9, they saw a large crowd around them, around the 9, I suppose, and some scribes arguing with them. Again, I would assume the scribes were arguing with the 9. They're trying to keep track of Jesus. Remember, we are in Gentile territory, so they've traveled outside of Israel to do this. Now, we're not told what the argument was about, but I guess it probably will come out of the mouth of a father in distress. My supposition is that it was dealing with this boy that Christ is going to deal with. Through the Gospels, it seems that Jesus was often interrupted. This is not something new. He's often interrupted by someone in a crisis of one sort or another. However, he never seemed to treat the interruption as something negative or something else unwelcomed, but he responded each time with compassion. Again, I imagine the argument was between the scribes and the 9, with the crowd as primarily onlookers. They may have had an interest in this argument for one reason or the other. And by the way, Mark is the only one who mentions this event. So we find we're going to begin with the 9 disciples, the scribes, a crowd, and an argument supposedly at the foot of the Mount of Transfiguration. Couldn't have been too far away, or there had been some travel involved. We aren't given anything like that. The impression is it took place at the foot of the mountain. Keep in mind, again, that this site was north of the Sea of Galilee, outside Israel, in Gentile-dominated land. That means, again, as I said a moment ago, the scribes had to intentionally travel outside of Israel to keep up with Jesus' teachings, and whatever else concerned the scribes about him. Okay? So that's where we are. Verse 15. And immediately when the entire crowd saw him, now remember, this is a crowd outside of Israel, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. It seems clear that they had some reason or some way to recognize Jesus. They knew enough about him to be in wonderment at his presence with them and moved to be closer to him. It may have been that they were simply picking up a lot of stuff from this argument between the 9 and the scribes. Some believe that Jesus' face still glowed from the transfiguration, just as Moses' face continued to glow after he descended from Sinai and his time in God's presence there. There's no way to verify, however, that Jesus' face still shone. If his face were showing his glory, then his telling the 3 to keep it under their hats and to not tell anyone about what they saw, that wouldn't really do much good if Jesus' glory persisted to be evident. It may simply be that the crowd recognized this was a most opportune time for Jesus' presence and his power. And I can't verify that either. Or it may simply represent their wonderment at Jesus' presence with them. No one knows for certain. But Jesus asks about the argument. So he was curious about it. He knew they were arguing. Again, this discussion is raised by Mark alone. So he sees this as Jesus being proactive, I suspect, in a situation that he was a man of action, and he took action to deal with his compassion. Verse 16, and he asked them, the 9, I guess, what are you discussing with them, the scribes? Jesus really received no direct answer unless the Father's words explained. So look at what happened. He asked, I think, the 9 a question, and it says in verses 17 and 18, and one of the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute, and whenever it seizes him, it dashes him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth, and he grinds his teeth, and he stiffens out. And I told your disciples, which remember, Jesus and the 3 were up on the mountain, so the crowd and the Father in particular did not have access to Jesus. He took the next best thing, the 9 of his closest disciples who were present. And I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it. So the Father has some kind of frustration. Now, he brought the Son to Jesus, so he had some knowledge about Jesus, and we would assume had some faith or some reason to have faith in Jesus' ability to deal with the Son's problem. The scribes are checking up on Jesus. Just think about it. They find the 9. The 9 fail in attempts to exorcise a demon. What a chance for the scribes to belittle the 9 and Jesus with them. They could say, you guys don't have any power. You don't have anything special going on. And of course, Jesus wasn't there to defend that position one way or the other. Defend it, defeat it. So could that have been what the argument was about between the scribes and the 9? The scribes making fun of their inability to exorcise the demons? Well, we don't know, and we're not told. One thing does seem clear, though. The foaming at the mouth, the grinding of the teeth, and the times of rigidity are all evidences of epilepsy. Epilepsy. That's only, what, 3 syllables? But it got me tangled up as bad as if it were 6. The boy was not only demon-possessed, he was an epileptic who experienced seizures. The demon made him deaf. One assumes that he would be equivalent of deaf. He was mute, he couldn't speak, so if he heard, he couldn't tell you. Only this is given in Mark. Again, the whole event happens in Mark only. But that's not all. Matthew 17, Matthew goes on and says more. The boy's father is speaking here in Matthew. Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic and is very ill. For he often falls into fire and into the water. The episodes where fire is concerned may have left the son marked, increasing the social difficulties that the son would have. If you have epilepsy, if he's demon-possessed, if he's showing burns, scars from burns, he would be a difficult time for him socially and meeting other people. It seems that in those days, by the way, there were significant open fires and unfenced open bodies of water around to pose a real danger to life and limb. So this isn't something that he'd had to go to a certain place to be burned and so forth. No, this was pretty well widespread in Israel and in this case in Gentile territory. That's just the way it was, apparently. But take a moment and consider the inability of the 9 to exorcise a demon. On their mission, just not too much before this, they had exorcised demons, healed the sick using the power of Jesus, excuse me, using the power that Jesus assigned them. Might they have felt that they have that power inherent in their own being rather than God's power authorized by Jesus? Maybe they just took it for granted that they could do this for any reason at any time. We don't really know. But knowing human nature, that would not be unreasonable to be expected. Might this have been a lesson for the 12 as to what their life would look like when Jesus' earthly presence is over? Because remember, Jesus wasn't with them at this point in time. They were on their own. And they evidently did not go to significant prayer invoking God's authority or asking for God's authority. They simply tried to do it. That would be my guess. Jesus shows some exasperation. Hey, I got that one out pretty well. At the dullness of the 12 and the scribes, but in keeping with his nature, he answered the father, the boy's father, with compassion that always marked his concern for the lad. This is in verse 19 of Mark. And he, Jesus, answered them. Well, I don't know whether that's the 9, the crowd, the father and the crowd, whoever was around. I guess Jesus answered and said, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? Of course, the answer is just down to a couple months. How long shall I put up with you? Again, a couple months. Bring him, that's the lad, bring the lad to me. And look at the violence of the demon next. And they brought the boy to him, to Jesus. And when the demon, saw Jesus, immediately the spirit threw the boy into a convulsion, and with him falling to the ground, the boy began rolling about and foaming at the mouth. So this demon says, I may have to go because I know who is telling me I have to go, but I'm not going quietly. Typically, demons would let out some kind of shriek or scream and then do their dastardly deed and then follow Jesus' command. Jesus shows his compassion as he asks the Father when he sees this thing with the demon. And Jesus asks his Father, how long has this been happening to him? And he, the boy's father, said, from childhood. Only Mark has Jesus asking this question. Again, not a surprise because he's the only one doing the whole thing. But there's something that bothers me. And he, the boy's father, said from childhood. Wait a minute. We've just been saying this is a boy. He's in his childhood. What? How old must the boy have been for the father to respond as he did? It seems to me that the father no longer saw his son as a boy, as a very young child. Perhaps it might be that the lad was beyond the bar mitzvah age of 12 or 13, but still not an adult in our way of thinking. Like he probably was still maybe in his teens, maybe even his upper teens. We're not told. He could have been an early teen, a mid-teen, a late teen, but it seems to me he has to be out of the age of prior to 12 because of the father not calling him a boy, saying when he was a boy this started. And if he were still a boy, it would seem he would have answered differently. But that's just my thinking. Sometimes in these, it doesn't matter how many times you've looked at a verse of Scripture, there's something different pops up that you'd never noticed before. Let's go to verse 22 of Mark. And the father is still answering, and it has often thrown the boy both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. Evidently, the father saw that as the demon's job, his task, his goal. What he was after was to destroy this lad. And then the father continues, but if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And of course, that was a famous statement, if you can do anything. And this is Jesus he's talking to. The man may be a Gentile, we don't know. The final segment of his plea, though, didn't go unnoticed by Jesus. He says in 9:23 of Mark, and Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. And it is interesting, the father's response had the smell of unbelief in Jesus' ability to heal his son when he said, if you can. I think what probably he thought he was saying, if you will, but it came out, if you can. And so Jesus brings the issue of faith to the forefront. He often expected belief as an active force in healings and exorcism. Think of the last healings of the deaf-dumb man and the blind man, in which he used sign language to stimulate their faith and their belief. Was the Father just another guy, maybe a Jew, maybe not, who doubted Jesus' power? But think about it. He had to have some belief in Jesus' ability to bring the boy to him. But in Jesus' absence, the inability of the 9 to heal the boy likely gave a blow to the father's belief. The father was probably showing this damaged belief that he had, knowing that Jesus had often proved that he could heal, but he wondered if Jesus would heal at this time. But doesn't that really hit at our own belief in Jesus, the Father, the Holy Spirit? We think, I know God can, but I don't know if he will in my case. We have to allow God his own choices, you know. Sounds good and spiritual, doesn't it? But is it really? Or is it our hedge against a negative answer to our prayer? But Pop, in this case, answered pretty well. In verse 24, immediately the boy's father cried out and began saying, I do believe. Help my unbelief. His answer isn't a self-contradiction as it might appear. He began with belief to even bring the boy to Jesus. The belief took a shot when the 9 failed. His belief was not perfect or even what it should have been. So he asked Jesus' help in taking his belief to the next level, to where it needed to be for Jesus to act on behalf of his son. Well, Jesus responds as you know he would in verse 25. And when Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly gathering, and he doesn't like big crowds in sensitive places or ways like this, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, You deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him. And catch this, something you haven't seen before in the Gospels. And do not enter him again. So Jesus said, you come out of him now, you never go back to him. He makes his healing unique by commanding the demon to never return to the boy. For some reason, he thought that was necessary here. Have you ever given thought as to the motive of the demon in the case of demon possession? I don't think we just say, well, he's nasty. Yeah, he is. But why? He had to have a purpose, not just to invade someone so he had a place to sack out or hide out or whatever. What was the demon's motive? What was he trying to accomplish? Well, it seems pretty clear in this case that there's always Satan's role as destroyer. That's what the father saw. He said, he's trying to destroy my son. Again, we see this particular demon's violence and obstinance. Watch this. After crying out, there's that shriek that is quite often present in an exorcism. Demons don't always go quietly. And after crying out and throwing the lad into terrible convulsions, it, the demon, came out. He didn't come out quietly. He came out noisily. He came out one last attempt to destroy the boy, throwing him into convulsions. And the boy became so much like a corpse, I assume that means he was quiet and he didn't move, that most of the crowd said, "He's dead." Well, evidently the lad, as I said, had become motionless and silent after his convulsion, leaving the impression that he was dead, because the convulsion would have been violent. But most of the crowd were wrong. Look at verse 27. But Jesus took him, excuse me, the lad by the hand and raised him, and he got up. I want you to notice something here. What did Jesus do? Did he just say, "Hey, get up"? No. He took him by the hand. He reached down, he touched him, he took his hand, and he helped him up. In view of the comment about those believing the boy was dead, go back to Jesus' raising of Jairus' daughter from death. And notice Mark's use of very similar language. As a matter of fact, let's look at that. Mark 5:41. And taking the child, that's Jairus' daughter, by the hand, just as he did with the boy, he said to her, Talitha cum, which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Here Jesus took him by the hand as he did the daughter and lifted him, and he got up. There's no indication he said anything to the lad at that point, but he may have, we don't know. And Mark 9:28, and when he had come into the house, somehow they have a house. Now this is in Gentile territory, so it's not Peter's house or one of his friends, as far as we know. This was just some house that he had access to. When they got in there, anyhow, his disciples began questioning him privately. Why could we not cast it out? They saw that they failed in a task they had previously been successful in. And a very brief answer that may reflect their own attitude when they tried the exorcism but failed. Let's look at that. And he, Jesus, said to them, the 9, this, probably to the whole 12 at this time, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. What does that tell you? These guys didn't pray. They didn't get God the Father involved. They didn't pray to Jesus. They didn't ask for the Holy Spirit to help, because all he said is this one needs prayer. So one would assume there's a good chance they didn't invoke God's help. It may have been, as I said, an indication that they were working in their own personal power rather than leaning on and depending upon God's power. They thought it was inherent within themselves. The answer is no. It was given to you under a mandate for use. Some translations also say this slightly different. And this phrase that I'm going to read comes from Matthew 17:10, but it's thought by most to not have been an original part of Matthew's writing. But this kind does not go out. I mean, this kind of demon cannot be exorcised except by prayer and fasting. The and fasting is not found in the best manuscripts. It's found in quite a few, and that's why some use it, some do not. There is some sense, though, in which it doesn't matter whether you have prayer or prayer and fasting, because if people were praying about a very serious situation in those days, they probably fasted as part of that prayer effort. For a variety of reasons, the addition of fasting again is believed to be an editorial addition, not in the original of Matthew's work. Perhaps it was put in by a later editor in order to reflect the cultural practice of fasting when praying over very serious matter. When a demon is here's a question for you. When a demon is exorcised, where does he go? Especially if it's not into a herd of pigs. Where does he go? You ever wonder about that? Well, next time we're going to see Jesus answer a question about greatness. You might want to